Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of Friday Morning at the Funhouse with Martin Popoff. What's happening, my friend?
Nothing much. Just a cold, dreary day here. It's going to snow again in Toronto. Although I bought a bike. The other day and I pick it up today. So that's cool. But nice. Then I'm going to find out it's winter again. I can't use it, but.
Is this a new one replacing an old one, or is this a first bike in a while?
My old mountain bike I kept for over 30 years.
Wow.
And, and I just kept fixing it up and never needed much work, but it was, finally the grips, the rubber in the grips broke down into like petroleum. I suppose I could have replaced the grips, but, and then I just got a flat and decided, you know what, I'm just putting this out. Forget it. I'm going to get a new one. So yeah, I kept my old one for 30 years. So this is first one in a long, long time.
Very cool. I need to get a bike again. When we bought this house back in 2009, we each had bikes, and we don't really live where we live is not really conducive to bike riding. There's no shoulder, because we're out like in the woods. But in like recent years, I have a couple buddies who bike ride a lot, and they've discovered a love for that. And they're like, "Oh, you got to get a bike. We'll go bike riding." I'm like, so I probably should do it. It's just something else to do to stay fit, keep active, whatever. But the weather kind of sucks around here, and there's only certain times a year you can actually ride a bike. But I don't know. We'll see. But yeah,
Toronto's awesome for biking. I mean, and we're right downtown Toronto, but there's bike lanes everywhere. There's bike trails everywhere. There's off-road trails. This isn't exactly a mountain bike. My old one was, but you could just every difficulty level is within like 5-10 minutes a year. It's
really that's wonderful. Yeah, see, if I lived in an area like that, I would definitely have one. I kind of miss it sometimes, but I think eventually I'm going to cave and I'm just going to get one. It's just something to do, and I walk a lot now, but I think it'd be a lot more fun to ride. You get a little farther and go different places, and the few times I have done it, because I do have a buddy who's got an extra one. So occasionally he'll convince me to come out, and then, we'll hop in his pickup truck. I'll throw both the bikes in the back. We'll drive somewhere, get out, get on the bikes, do 9-10 miles and come home. And then of course I'm completely shot because I haven't been bike riding in so many years. And
well, that's the thing. It's all different muscle memory, right? It's like just working different muscle groups subtly, sitting on a bike versus walking versus running versus swimming versus weights, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Swimming I'm ready for, but it's not quite yet. A little too cold yet still, right? So today's topic is another topic that has been recommended by one of our viewers, and it's a cool one, and I think we'll have some good conversation about it today. So this topic is about those bands that kind of waited too long, right? Or maybe kind of bad timing. So in other words, they released an album did pretty good, or maybe it did great, and they had this momentum going, and then ... years went by. Finally, they got around to putting out that next album, and I think maybe things kind of passed them by. So we're going to talk about some of these bands that they really just waited too long, and maybe by the time they decided to get their act together, the timing was really bad. So we'll have 5 examples for each, and I'll have Martin kick us off with his first one for the day.
Okay, I'm going to start with my most modest band, my tiniest band, but they are mighty, the mighty Angel Witch. Love this album to death. So essentially this came out in 1980, right in the thick of the beginning of the new wave of British heavy metal. I love my new wave of British heavy metal, and this was literally the best first album. It's better than the first Iron Maiden album. It's a masterpiece. It literally for a long time, and maybe it still remains. In fact, when I do new wave of British heavy metal lists, I usually put this as the greatest new wave of British heavy metal album. You got your songs there with Atlantis and Gorgon and all that stuff. Angel Witch, Confused, Angel of Death. Freeman. Well, that's kind of a mellow one on here. Atlantis. But just kind of like good Sabbathy, doomy stuff. I mean, literally, I almost sometimes I include these guys as the first doom band. That might be Witchfinder General. I mean, after Black Sabbath, right? But literally, this is 1980, so it's before Witchfinder General. But unfortunately, they were definitely a case of waited too long. They were on Bronze Records, which was great. People loved this album. I remember there was always a little bit of ridicule of them live. Maybe they weren't that great live. They were a trio. They had their hands full, a lot of stuff they had to do here. But what happened was, I think there was some drug and drink involved. And, and they basically faltered and didn't really move on. There was the Loser Dr. Phibes single in there, which was kind of promising, but it wasn't until 1985 that they did their next album, Screaming and Bleeding. It was a long time from now. They had lost their bronze deal by then. So essentially, Angel Witch just missed the boat of this new wave of British heavy metal where everybody was doing quite well. They absolutely should have followed this up. They're always talked about along with Iron Maiden in terms of, Iron Maiden's trajectory just took off like a rocket and Angel Witch is just sunk. But I will argue to the death that this was a better album than the first Iron Maiden album. Maybe not better than Killers, and Number of the Beast, but it's better than the first Maiden. It's an absolute masterpiece, and unfortunately waited too long. Vocals were amazing. Kevin Hayborn was the writer, guitarist, vocalist, but when they came back later, Kevin had ceded the lead vocal position to David Tatum. So essentially it didn't even really sound like the same band anymore. So yeah, kind of a big too bad on this one. The early singles and all that, it was amazing, but definitely a case of waiting too long.
Yeah, a legendary band from that scene that should have been one of the greats, right? And you still look at the stuff they've released, and they've been coming back in recent years with some really good material.
Amazing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Proving that they were no fluke. I mean, those latest Angel Witch albums are masterpieces as well.
Yeah. You put those latest albums back in 82, 81, 82, 83. And what do you have? Maybe one of the big bands on the planet alongside Maiden and Saxon and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
That's a great start to this discussion here. My first choice for today is Pink Floyd. So 1979, The Wall comes out. Of course, we know how enormous The Wall was, basically a pinnacle of everything that Pink Floyd had done throughout the 70s. One of the biggest bands of the 70s with albums like Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, so on and so forth. They come out with this big double concept album, this grand idea from Roger Waters. It becomes huge. I think to date it's sold over 20 million copies. Great big tour. Pink Floyd's everywhere. You got hit singles on here, all these songs played on FM radio, and The Wall is, by many people regarded as one of their absolute masterpieces. And you would figure, well, Pink Floyd, now one of the biggest bands in the world, huge selling album, huge selling tour, songs played all over the radio, an absolute masterpiece that they would kind of continue their dominance in the very near future after it. But lo and behold, that never really happened. And before you know it, you got problems developing within the band. Richard Wright is basically jettisoned from the band, and Roger decides to put together this other little opus of an album that took a long time to kind of come to fruition. It's even darker and more personal than The Wall, and that is The Final Cut in 1983, which is almost like the antithesis of this and everything that came before it. Whereas, this, even though this is, kind of this heavy, dark stuff, not heavy like heavy metal heavy, but the concept wise, this even more so. And where you had songs that were radio friendly and became Pink Floyd classics on that album, here you have these very melancholy tracks, and it's very much coming from the mind of Mr. Waters, and not something that resonated with a ton of people. So you went from, and I think looking at the sales figures today in overall from 83, this is barely squeaked out 2 million sales copies, as opposed to The Wall, and as opposed to all those other albums that we spoke about from the 70s. And I think that even if they would have released this within 2 years after The Wall, I think we might have seen a bit more sales, a bit more acceptance of this album. But I think it took a while to come out. It is the album that it is. I mean, for me, everybody who's watching this knows I'm not a big fan of this album, right? But that doesn't really factor in here. It's like this album just doesn't have a lot of what made The Wall so accessible for so many people. And literally the band splintered after this. And so again, would it have made much of a difference with these exact same songs in 1981? I don't know. Deep down inside, I think not, because I think this was just a really personal album that some people have gotten over the years. They fully appreciate and love this album, but the masses that accepted Wish You Were Here and Animals and Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall kind of felt a little turned off by this. And again, it could be the time in between. It could just be that this is just not that kind of Pink Floyd album. I don't know, but 4 years with the momentum of The Wall and everything that came before it, just kind of proved to be a little bit too long. And then, this basically just was the death knell of Waters in Pink Floyd. And then he, of course, went on to a very, very successful solo career. Gilmour decided to take the reins and continue on with Pink Floyd. Fairly successful, but in the minds of a lot of people was never the same after this album. So there you have it. The Wall and the Final Cut, 4 years in between, big drop off.
Yeah, the funny thing about the waited too long concept with Pink Floyd is also the sub narrative is almost like they barely toured The Wall. Like, imagine if they would have gone on the road and played The Wall dozens and dozens and dozens of times all over mainland
Europe. It was more about
Europe,
the big spectacle shows, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Imagine what the sales would have been of The Wall had they done that, right?
Yeah.
So they definitely waited too long to put on big tours, because that didn't happen until after the Waters List album, right?
Yeah.
So and you're right. I mean, this album didn't really have any singles or whatever, but yeah, had they gone on tour, had they put out the Final Cut and then went on tour, also they would have just been clicking over albums sales of the four big ones over and over and over again, right?
Yeah.
So it's almost like this is one of those situations like AC/DC, where had they toured the Final Cut, they would have been touring The Wall. Essentially, that's what would have been selling. The Wall would have been outselling the Final Cut 2-1 had they just toured in 82, 83, 84, right?
Yeah. And how many, they did those big massive shows for The Wall, but how many of them did they actually do?
Yeah, I forget now. I just had to write up all about this, but it was like 2 here and 10 here or something like that. It was like they just set up in New York and in London, and I think that might be it. Maybe one other place, but they set up and did a few runs of it. But that's it. I think I've probably made about 5 mistakes here, but I'm thinking about a dozen. I'm thinking it. If I had to pick. So it really wasn't all that much.
Yeah. And I think it's more like we remember back the grand spectacle of them. So it was more about the quality and the bigness of them and not about quantity, right? Because it's like sometimes you think back, it's like, oh yeah, they played everywhere. They really didn't. I think, you're absolutely right. I think Roger Waters as a solo artist has gone on to do these Wall tours, many years later, and made them the big far-reaching spectacle that it's become. But yeah, I mean, Pink Floyd were arguably one of the biggest bands on the world. And you think about it, they probably could have been even bigger than they were. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. I mean, imagine, I think they could have almost doubled the sales of The Wall, had they toured it for 2.5, 3 years, right? Yeah. Crazy. Yeah. Huh. Okay. My next choice is Peter Gabriel. So here's someone who starts with, Genesis, of course, but then there's all these. There's these well-respected smallish albums, right? Definitely well-respected, and then starting to make some big waves with this one, right? Very innovative album, and then kind of has a hit or two with this one. Does the live album in between. There's your German version of Security right there. Has the big live album. I saw them on tour. And then, the So album is the big one. This is with the Kate Bush duet and all that. Don't Give Up hits. It eventually goes 5 times platinum. Security goes gold. But this is one of those funny situations where the success is like massive respect and creative success for him, starting with the Face Melt album, really. I mean, the first 2 are a little more conservative. But that one is so innovative and cool, and so many cool sounds, and the kind of the semi invention of the gated drum sound and Phil Collins and all that. And then this groundbreaking kind of pastiche between world music and progressive rock that results in that big tour. And it was messianic seeing him on that tour of Security. That's where I saw him. My favorite concert of all time. I'm sure I've said this a million times, but the Tubes, then Peter Gabriel, then David Bowie, first concert in Vancouver, BC Place, right? So essentially, he was so well respected, and he was kind of a hit artist by then. There was the long wait to the So album, but the long wait that if you put it on your manager's hat, that would say, "Oh, this is crazy. You have to strike while the iron is hot," is the wait from So going up to Us with this one, right? And then there's a live album up in there, and then there's another long wait to Up. But essentially, the wait to this one, a manager would be pulling out his hair and saying, "This is crazy. You should not do this. People love you right now. You've got all these hit singles." On So, he had essentially done a slightly commercial version of the world music and rock pastiche, right? Just a little more poppy and straightforward. But then the problem with this is this just feels like an overworked version of So. It's just all the kind of the same themes again. The songs are long, so they could use an edit. There's only 10 on it. But the wait to this was 86 to 92. And this went, I think it went platinum, but not beyond platinum. But So but it was 3 times platinum by 91, and it's 5 times platinum now. So was a massive record. With Red Rain was a hit, Sledgehammer was the big hit, Don't Give Up was a big hit, In Your Eyes was a big hit, Mercy Street I think was a single, Big Time was even a fair bit of a hit. Yep. So literally, you only have that voice again, and we do what we're told, that aren't pretty massive songs on this album. So, couple songs out of 8 that weren't pretty big on this record. So that's pretty incredible. Yeah, it's interesting. So it's another one with so this one doesn't have an album title on the cover either. It's got big album title on the back, but it doesn't even have Peter Gabriel on the cover either. So that's a few cases of waiting too long, but it's also a case of, I think Peter Gabriel was so comfortable in his own skin and so happy, probably, for the creative respect, although he doesn't even really need that. I mean, he knows he's been creative and did these amazing masterpiece records in a row, that he just doesn't care. Like, however successful they are was how successful they are. Fact of the matter is, even though the record sales weren't through the roof, except for So, he was massively famous and just so respected for what he had done. So yeah, it's a funny one. It's a long wait, but it's like a cool long wait. It's like, I don't care. Just going to do what I do. The creativity will come when it will come.
And that's always the way he's operated, right?
Yeah.
So you mentioned something just a couple minutes ago, strike while the iron is hot, that I think for a lot of bands, especially in the 70s and into the 80s, it's something you had to do, because it's amazing when we look back on like the album charts year to year, month to month, back in the old days, and we see just the glut of all these what we now consider classic albums that were all out at the same time, that people were scooping up left and right. So, and you had new bands and classic bands, and you had to strike while the iron was hot, because there was so much strong competition that if you waited too long, you could be the big band today, and in 3 years, that might not be the case anymore. And I think that was a perfect example of that is this band that I'm going to talk about right now, who were the darlings of the universe in 1979. And they had been building up to that with all of the albums that came before that. They had a couple that sold pretty decent. They were getting a lot of respect. Then they had this big album, and they were literally one of the biggest bands of the year in 1979. I'm talking about Supertramp with Breakfast in America. Now, this album was everywhere in 1979, all over the radio, and kind of like your example with the Peter Gabriel, like 60% of this album was played on the radio, just to the point where you were like, oh my God, Supertramp, Breakfast in America again. I think I've heard enough of it. But this did 4 times platinum. This made these guys superstars, and all the hard work they did on, Crisis, What Crisis, and Crime of the Century, and even in their quietest moments, they literally every year and a half were releasing a new album, gaining in popularity. This was the culmination of it. I mean, the logical song, Goodbye Stranger, the title track, Take the Long Way Home, all these songs, a lot of really strong deep cuts on this album. This was like a really well-received album. I don't even remember this won any Grammys or anything like that, but this was a huge album for them. And then inexplicably, and not in line with what they had done throughout all that career, they go the rest of 79, they do the tour, whatever. 1980, there's nothing. 1981, there's nothing. Finally, in 1982, all the way at the end of the year, they come out with Famous Last Words. And there's nothing on here that's kind of hit single material. It's a strong album. I like this album. But part 2 of this, it definitely is not. By 1982, what's going on in the world, Martin, right? We know everything that's pop. New wave is hot. Pop music is hot. All the commercial hard rock and metal is just starting to come out of the woodwork. Thrash is getting ready to start pretty soon. So all of a sudden, this quirky British band who plays this kind of like art rock, pop, prog music, whatever, it's kind of out of fashion, right? Look what happened with bands like Gentle Giant and Yes and Genesis. It's like either you had to change what you were doing or you went by the wayside. And this album, while pretty good, barely got any notice at all, didn't get any airplay at all, barely squeaked out gold. And before you know it, that was basically the end of Supertramp's career in the spotlight, sadly. It's a good album, probably deserved better at the time, but did they wait too long after the mega success that this was? 3 years might not seem like a lot, but when it comes to people following music and bands, and a new decade had started since this, a lot of changes were happening in the early 80s. 3 years was way too long in this instance.
That's a great example, and it's a great point. I mean, because they really do have a 70s sound. It's almost like a yacht rock sound, right?
Kind of. Yeah.
So yeah, had they struck in 1980, they would have still been dealing with the hangover of a 70s sound before there were all these changes, right?
Yeah.
I often wonder also if having so many great hits off of that record saved for kind of all time the older hits off the earlier albums, which might have, had they not had a big hit with this album, maybe all of Supertramp would have fallen off the radio playlist, right? But it kind of like locked those in as saying, okay, Supertramp, we're going to allow them to live, and they've got a half dozen songs that you just always hear on classic rock radio now, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that the success of Breakfast in America elevated those 3 albums that came before it in a big way, but it didn't work with the album that came after, ironically enough.
Yeah.
And maybe when it comes down to it, maybe it's just the Famous Last Words just isn't as good, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
But it didn't work.
Okay.
It worked reverse, but not going forward. The hangover effect didn't quite happen, which is a shame.
Yeah. Okay, my next choice is, and I honestly, I'm almost making a call here on which gap that I'm going to talk about here, but I would say the gap between we're talking about the Cult. So Sonic Temple was a follow up to this one, and they came fast together, and people were in love with the Cult. I mean, they Electric with that great Rick Rubin production, and Sonic Temple. You've got the Bob Rock situation there, but then there's Ceremony comes out relatively quickly. But at this point, they don't really, they're already fighting. In between, there was a situation where Ian's father died from cancer, but they are fighting. Jamie Stewart leaves the band. He's a bass player, moves to Canada, I believe. So basically, you have a record that doesn't sound like Sonic Temple, and you're up into a situation where music is changing. But I think it's this gap I want to talk about the most. I think the gap from Ceremony, which is 91, I believe, up to 94. Jamie Laszlo and I did a Contrarians episode on this, and he picked it as his favorite cult album. And I really am almost in agreement with him on it. I remember when this came out, thinking that there's a lot of songs I love a lot on it, and a lot of songs I don't like the direction on it, because they're kind of noisy and sort of tribal or raw. But you look at the back of this, it's sort of the standard grunge look to the band. Yep. But unfortunately, by 94, they've already missed the grunge boat, because the grunge boat was biggest in like 91, 92 with the big bands out of Seattle. So the gap from here to here with 3 years, they're already trying to play catch up here, where they could have been in there. I remember for Goldmine, I think I wrote, because grunge has a really complicated history of influences, right? And I actually argued for the fact that the Cult feels like a little bit of a grunge influence, or a band that even if the grunge bands weren't overt in saying that the Cult were a big influence, you look at all the things they did together, from being a goth band through to being a metal band, through to being, just a cool artistic band and having kind of this interesting image. They could have had they done something like possibly a little more like this, crossed with Ceremony, in 92 or 93. I think they could have been one of the big bands totally participating in the grunge thing in a big way. They would have been one of the distinctive From Away grunge bands, right? But by the time you get to this, band relations have been bad for a long time. It had a few songs that did okay. There was a little bit of excitement behind it, because there was such a long gap, and Ceremony wasn't that well received. But they'd more or less missed the boat in. And by 94, you're already getting into things like post grunge or hard alternative or industrial or techno, industrial metal. White Zombie and 9 Inch Nails is starting to be big. Smashing Pumpkins is kind of a late arriving grunge band that's pretty big, a From Away grunge band from Chicago, right? But yeah, it's funny. It's almost like the missing the boat starts post Sonic Temple, and then so it's a little bit too long and not doing the same thing again. They could have, from a management point of view, another Sonic Temple and a big Bob Rock kind of, arena rock album would have been amazing to have come out of these guys in 89 or 90, while hair metal was still big, right? Yep. While arena, they would have been an appealing band that's better than hair metal, but they're still participating in that, which is what Sonic Temple kind of does. So yeah, they kind of missed it in a couple ways there. But again, a little bit like Peter Gabriel, Ian Astbury and Billy Duffy are really cool, creative guys that pretty much don't care. I mean, I don't think they're really all that careerist. And I'm just so happy that the later Cult albums are amazing. Like they're just one of these bands that I always kick myself that I should be listening to all the time, and don't enough, because all of the later reunion albums are just, they're better than all the early albums. Really, they're just one of the really super strong bands now. So there you go, the Cult.
Yeah, they're one of these bands that I listened to quite a bit back in the day, and then I kind of fell out of following them in the early mid 90s for a lot of the reasons that you said. And I've recently got back into them and started discovering their more recent albums, like, the last like 3, 4, 5. Yeah. And I because I just wasn't following them at all. And we're going to be doing a ranking show here on the channel soon. And their more recent albums are kick ass. Yeah. Really, really good. And they're different, and different is good. I think this band has always kind of kept reimagining themselves over the years. But yeah, I even felt that Sonic Temple was them trying to changed their style and sound to kind of fit into what was going on in music at the time, but might have been like a year too late, even though that album did really, really well. Could you imagine if Sonic Temple came out a year or two before it actually did, if they had that kind of sound and kind of continued and put out albums fairly quickly after that, even before like 1992 came around? Yeah. You could be talking about one of the biggest bands on the planet. They had that small window where they kind of were, but it didn't last.
Yeah, absolutely. They had everything going for them where they could have been one of the biggest bands on the planet.
Yeah. You had the singer who had personality, had the look, right? He kind of sounded like Jim Morrison, which, people always are into that. You had this kind of cool guitar player with swagger. He had great songs, cool albums. Yeah.
I don't know for sure, but I get the feeling, I get the vibe that they were a little difficult to deal with, those guys. I don't know. I mean, I just know, I know for sure with us in the magazine, Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles, they did not want to be called metal, and they would never talk to us because they just did not want to be in any metal publications. Right. So that was kind of a funny thing about them, but I just get the feeling they are because they obviously fought together quite a bit as well. And I get the feeling that maybe there might be a small element, a percentage of sabotaging your own career in there somehow.
It's possible. They wouldn't be the only ones who've done that.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So kind of the poster child for this exercise today is a little band out of Boston called Boston. So we all know the history of that debut album, right? From 1977, 76, 76. So has sold gazillion albums out of the gate, started off slowly, but then picked up steam. They became one of the biggest bands on the planet. Took them 2 years to follow up that album with Don't Look Back, which, quite frankly, the only reason it came out in 1978 is because the record label, which was Epic Records, was pushing Tom Schultz and company to get another album out. So in other words, like Martin said earlier, strike while the iron is hot. If you're a new band with a debut album that sells millions and millions of copies, you got to come right back out there again. Because again, this was the 70s, lots of competition. Tom Schultz was not wanting to put this album as quickly as they did, because let's go back in time a little. That debut album was gestating for quite a while. Tom is not the guy who works quickly, but they did release Don't Look Back in 78, sold 7 million copies. Of course, they followed that up many years later, 1986, as a matter of fact, with Third Stage. So by this point in time, most people are thinking that Boston is done, dead, right? You've had people coming and going from the band. They're not touring, they're not doing anything. It's almost like, Boston is this dinosaur that kind of fell into extinction. So, but it does come out in 1986, and I guess the heart was still pretty fond for music from this band by the fans, because again, we're looking at, between the first album and Don't Look Back, we're looking at, over 30 million copies, 40 million, whatever the number is. So this comes out in 86. It still sells 4 million copies here in the States. It still spurns a hit single in Amanda, a couple of the tracks they play live still to this day whenever they do tour. So this does pretty good. It's kind of, for a lot of people, not really Boston anymore, because it's basically Tom, and you've got Brad Delp on here. That's basically about it. So then they do a tour here, whatever. They go into hiding, and then we don't hear from them again till Walk On in 1994. I hear you've got a completely different band. In fact, if I remember correctly, I don't even think Brad is on this album at all. And this just goes platinum. So I think now we're finally seeing the fruits of their inactivity. And by this point in time, so now we're looking at what, 8 years? Yeah, 8 years. It's been 8 years between each of the last two albums. So in 16 years, we've got 2 releases. And I think the fatigue of waiting for Boston, the fatigue of who's in Boston, is this just Tom? Are the songs any good? To I don't care anymore, definitely happened by the time this came out. And truth be told, not a bad album, actually. I actually kind of dig this album. But is this Boston anymore, or is it just Boston in name only? And has it just been too long? Because we just talked about with the cult, 1994, is this kind of music in favor anymore? Not really, except for all of us old classic rock fans, but people have moved on. You got grunge, alternative, hip hop. We've got the industrial scene coming up, new metal, all that kind of stuff is right around the corner. And, Walk On is just old news at this point in time, way too long. So the big, huge band from 15 years prior, now all of a sudden is barely selling platinum. So way too long. But as we know in history, he continued to do this. The one that came after this was many years after this. That's the way Tom Schultz operates, unfortunately. And he still made a lot of money and sold millions of records despite himself and despite this. But again, it goes back to saying, well, Boston probably could have been one of the biggest bands in the world for a number of years had this not been the issue. So, but now we look back and it's like a pretty cool career, but all the bouts of inactivity, I think in the long run really hurt them quite a bit.
Yeah, cool. All right. Okay, I won't comment because I feel like I've been yapping too long on everything. So I'm going to also keep this one shorter as well. My next one is Down. And I remember there was a lot of buzz around this band when this thing came out in 94. There's the cool Jesus smoking a cigarette shot on the back, right? They were in Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles. Everybody was excited about them. It was really cool that this was almost like a more commercial and straightforward version of Pantera. There was a lot of goodwill for Pantera at the time. There was a lot of goodwill for Corrosion of Conformity at the time, Crowbar. So this with a management hat on, it's almost like somebody should have been able to read the tea leaves and realize that, even though this is an underground hit, there's a lot of excitement for the band at this time. Metal fans were loving this supergroup, and the production was amazing. It had semi-hit singles on it, but for one reason or another, I mean, these guys were obviously into a lot of substances and they were busy with their own bands and they toured a lot. It took a long time to have a second album come out. So NOLA is September 19th, 95. And then we move on to essentially March 26, 2002 with Down 2. And the magic is gone. There's not a lot of excitement around this album. There's a little bit, but mainly the band's sound has changed so much. They've gone from this shiny, hot car sound of a beast. It's like if Pantera is money riffs all the time, Down was almost like the money riff version of Pantera, like the accessible version of Pantera. Phil was up there just singing up a storm. A lot of excitement, like I say. So Down 2 comes out with the convoluted title, Down to a Bustle in Your Hedgerow. And then, there's my advances of these, your Philip Anselmo interview disc. There's a lot of cool stuff around the band at the time. You've got Over the Under, you've got these EPs and stuff. Then they get into the whole complicated EP thing. I hate EPs. I hate the whole idea of them. Just finish it, make it a full album, right? But to me, this was a big kind of missed opportunity where I really think for Pepper, definitely, and for Kirk, and possibly even for Phil, if Phil's already fighting with the Abbott brothers, like here's your release valve. Down could have been a big band, had they put out an album in 94 and 96 and 98 and had this catalog going of these really cool, kick-ass mainstream heavy metal songs with Phil's voice up top. It just feels like a big missed opportunity. So there you go, Down.
That's a great example. Yeah, they waited way too long. And I like that second album, but it's definitely different. It's kind of mellow in spots. It's got this psychedelic thing going. It's a good album. Stoner.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely, yeah. But that first album is like immense. Imagine if they put out part 2 of that, like within a year and a half, man.
Yeah.
We wouldn't even be talking about them today. Right.
Yeah. They sound like world beaters. Like we're winning. We're conquering stages with these songs. Right.
Right. That's what a supergroup debut should sound like, right? Yeah. I mean, that is just one of the great examples of a supergroup, a debut album that just works on every level. So good. Yeah, great example. All right, my next choice here, 1983, Yes comes out seemingly from the dead and releases 90125. but it's a different Yes, right? So with the drama album, of course, we know after Tormato, John Anderson, Rick Wakeman leave. We've got Steve Howe, Alan White, and Chris Squire. They get the two guys from the Buggles to come in. They release the drama album. At the time, a lot of people were kind of like anti-drama because, you know, no Anderson, no Wakeman, not really Yes. I think nowadays we look back on drama very fondly. It's a really strong album. But of course, that didn't last. After that, they break up. People go their separate ways. We've got Steve Howe goes off and joins Asia, right? So we've got Trevor Rabin, a very, very talented musician, vocalist, and songwriter, teams up with Chris Squire and Alan White. They put together this band called Cinema. They invite in Tony Kaye, original keyboard player from Yes. And then all of a sudden, John Anderson comes walking into the picture, and it turns out they decided to make it Yes again, because of course the record label is like, well, how many copies are we going to sell of a band called Cinema versus Yes? So obviously, Yes is the intelligent thing to do. They come out with this album, which ironically doesn't really sound a lot like classic Yes. But again, we've talked a lot here today and on the channel about the prog bands from the 70s making the transition into the 80s. A lot of them couldn't do it or didn't do it well. Yes, I think figured out that, all right, we've got to change up what we're doing a little bit. We've got to make it radio friendly. We've got to make it kind of big sounding with the modern production techniques. And 90125 goes on and sells 3 million copies, hit singles, Owner of a Lonely Heart, right, perennial favorite, and all this other really, really accessible, but somewhat challenging music, right? So Yes, all of a sudden is back in the big time. Big tour, right? All of a sudden, you know, Yes is popular once again. They decide to do a follow-up, and they get mired in the studio for year after year after year. Finally, 4 years later, and again, 1987, what's big in 1987? Hair metal, thrash, everything's big and heavy. They come out with a Big Generator with this just terrible album cover art, right? Terrible logo. And after all those years, an album that overall is just not great. It's okay. It's not very Yes-like at all. Even though this album doesn't sound like classic Yes, there are moments where you get that kind of cool 70s style prog going on there, but with a more modern take. This is just pop songs, hard rock. It's big, it's bold, it's probably overproduced. I think they spent way too much time in the studio. This barely gets to platinum, and basically has been like a long forgotten album in the discography of Yes over the years. And, you know, before you know it, the band, the members themselves are having issues with each other. You got the remaining other guys put together, Anderson, Wakeman, Bruford, Howe. There's this battle between the two. They eventually kind of get together and do the union thing. That doesn't last too long. And the history of Yes gets even more convoluted from there. But yeah, this definitely waited too long. I think if they would have followed up, even if they released this album within 2 years after 90125, probably would have done better. You know, there's a couple kind of hit singly things on here. You got Rhythm of Love and Love Will Find a Way, did okay, I guess, but nothing on the grand scale of 90125. 4 years proved to be a little bit too long.
Yeah, that's interesting in that, you know, had that come out sooner, Yes could have like been the band sustaining the idea of prog still at that point. But now you wait that long and prog is more or less dead, and you just put this big overproduced prog album into the middle of where there is no prog. I mean, Yes could have single-handedly been the band, you know, representing prog in a huge way moving forward, and prog might have even lasted longer and might have even dragged along a few other bands at that point. To have been still successful. But yeah, Big Generator is perfectly fine as a 1984 album. It sounds like it. So
yeah,
you know,
exactly.
Had it come out. And again, it's a situation you go on a big massive tour for Big Generator, and I swear to God, you're probably selling an equal amount of 90125 as you are selling Big Generator at that time, right? Yeah. All right, my last one for the day is Blue Oyster Cult with a specific gap. So, you know, there is a gap before this one, which is a little annoying as well, given that they have a big hit album. There's a lot of excitement around Blue Oyster Cult with Fire of Unknown Origin, but they put out a not all that particularly well-received double live album in between, Extraterrestrial Live. And then they put this out, which is a record that is still of the time. I mean, this is pre-hair metal. This is 1983. Bruce Fairbairn is producing. It gets a little bit of a complaint for, the profusion of electronic drums on it, but it does feel like an album that fits in that sort of Night Ranger, John Mellencamp, Bryan Adams range. Although at the heavy end, Sammy Hagar doing well at this time as well. This basically sounds like a Sammy Hagar, Standing Hampton kind of situation, but smarter, more intellectual at the lyric end and all that. But your Standing Hampton 3-lock box, first Night Ranger, second Night Ranger, that's kind of where this fits, and it fits fine. There is no hair metal yet. But by the time they get to this 3 years later, they're just at sea. They really, to quote Perfect Water, I suppose, off of this. But they're dancing in the ruins. They are, right?
They're definitely doing that.
Yeah. Beat them up. When the war comes, the wars come to the madness to the method. They don't have any method at this point. So so anyways, and they have to wave the white flag as well, right? So essentially, by this point, this doesn't sound like music that fits into anything anymore. It doesn't sound like Night Ranger anymore, or Sammy Hagar. Doesn't sound like hair metal. We're right in the thick of hair metal with this now. So you're moving from your big first wave hair metal bands into the start of Cinderella and Poison at this point. And there's lots of records, lots of bands selling a lot of records, and Blue Oyster Cult all along could have been one of those bands that is a legacy grandfather band that was allowed to live had they put out the right songs, had they had the right outside songwriters. I know I don't want them to have outside songwriters, but they do on here, and it just kind of seems to be the wrong outside songwriters. So there's a bit of that on here. There's even a bit of that on Revolution by Night, but so they don't do a heavy album. So they aren't participating in heavy metal really, and they don't do a hair metal album really either. It just sounds like an out of date, out of fashion, early 80s poppy hard rock album, just not even as good as the previous one, and just doesn't fit at all anywhere. They've lost Albert along the way. They lost Joe along the way. So they've lost some good songwriters in the band as well. So this is one of those, again, where, with a manager's hat on, it's like, how do we perpetuate the brand or keep the brand strong? They Blue Oyster Cult kind of did everything to destroy the brand. So there you go.
They didn't even try to fit in, right? I mean, I think that's what disappointed us so much as fans back when that album came out. And I think time has been a little kinder on that album all these years later. But at the time, we were like, it's not heavy at all. It's not proggy at all. It's not even overly interesting based on everything else that's going on. What is it? I don't know. It's got a couple of good tracks. Some of it, again, you got these outside writers and whatnot. Like I said, over the years, I think I appreciate that album for what it is. But man, when it came out, it sunk a quick death just because it just was like, it's like the band themselves didn't really know what direction to go into.
Yeah.
Which is a shame. All right. My last selection of the day is, this is a perfect example of dropping off of a cliff because you waited too damn long. So in 1977, one of the biggest albums of the year, it has since gone on to sell a gazillion number of albums across the world. The debut album from Meat Loaf, Bat Out of Hell. Okay, yeah. Right? Meat Loaf is on top of the world. It's got this partnership with Jim Steinman, making cool videos and touring everywhere, appearing on TV shows. Bat Out of Hell was, everybody owned it. Everybody listened to it. All these hit singles, legendary songs on this album. Everybody knows this album really, really well. You would have thought that Meat Loaf and this partnership with him and Jim Steinman were going to go take over the world and we're going to continue it on. Well, that kind of didn't happen. So Meat Loaf, they go out and tour. Meat Loaf kind of blows his voice out. He's got serious problems with his voice. Delays doing an album. They're Jim Steinman's writing material, whatnot. The album never comes out. They get tired of waiting. The record label says, all right, Jim, you're just going to go do a solo album. So a lot of the tracks that were going to be for the follow-up, Jim goes out and does himself. That does okay, but it's still not quite the same. Got to have the partners, kind of like the Elton John thing, right, with Bernie Taupin. So finally, they get their act together. And 4 years later, we get the Dead Ringer album, which, truth be told, pretty good album, actually. Unfortunately, nobody bought it. So you went from millions and millions and millions and millions of albums sold, and this barely does gold. I mean, think of that drop off in 1981. So basically, gold was 500,000 copies. So you went from selling, Martin, I don't even know how many millions Bat Out of Hell sold by this time.
Yeah.
10, 15, 20, I don't even know. I mean, it's crazy when you think about it. So what happened to all these people that bought this and loved this, that all of a sudden this was unacceptable? Again, we're going back to that whole, the new decade is in. People are listening to different stuff, new wave, hard rock, metal, all this sort of thing. And all of a sudden this kind of cinematic rock opera-ish stuff is, I guess, out of fashion. And it's a shame because there's actually some very good songs on here, and it's a good album. The album cover is very similar, right? You got the theme, you got this, the same logo, everything about it screams, okay, it should be good. It actually is pretty good. I mean, it's not quite the classic that the debut was, but man, in 4 years, people forgot completely who this guy was. Didn't even bother. Even bother. And it got worse from there. And it took like a decade later when they decided to do Bat Out of Hell Part 2, all of a sudden everybody's like, oh yeah, Meatloaf's cool again, right? We're revisiting the Bat Out of Hell theme. I'm all in, and that sells a gazillion copies. Then after that, he goes and does some other albums that don't sell. Then they revisit Bat Out of Hell for a third time. It sells 1 million copies. So basically, if you're Meatloaf, you should only ever do Bat Out of Hell albums, because otherwise nobody cares, right?
Yeah, like what a brilliant title, right? Bat Out of Hell 2. Good idea, right? Dead Ringer is so negative sounding too, right?
It kind of is. Yeah, it kind of is. But I mean, they really weren't even playing the shit on the radio. And the title track is good. Dead Ringer for Love. I'm Gonna Love Her for the Both of Us, I think, was released as a single. But it's not quite the classic that the first one was at all. But it's still pretty good. It's just but there was no carryover at all. So again, if they released Dead Ringer in 79 or 80, we're probably talking a little bit different here, but maybe not. But it just, man, nothing, not even a fraction. If it sold 3 million copies, you probably would have thought, all right, some people remember, but man, not even gold. Oof, that's bad. That's bad.
That's probably again, had that come out and he toured it for 2 years, he would have sold more copies during that 2 years of Bat Out of Hell than even Dead Ringer. But both would have, done well.
Yeah. It's weird. It's weird how this works, right? I mean, it's just, I think sometimes, again, not everybody's like you or me, or, there are, I can speak for myself here. Sometimes there's a brand loyalty, right? There's, if I get into a band and I love one of their albums, I'm generally going to support what they do next. All right. Because I love this so much. I will give the next one a try, whether it takes a year, 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years. But not everybody's like that. I think a lot of people are like, what's good today. If it's not there tomorrow, that's okay. I'll move on to something else. And I think that's the general public is like that. So if you're an artist, you can't rest on your laurels at all. Just because you sold 50 million copies of your debut album doesn't mean you're going to do that on your debut, on your second album, right? Whether you do it a year later or 5 years later, and in the case of Meatloaf, you can't even count on a quarter of the sales of what you did on that debut. So it's just fascinating to look at this stuff and to see these crazy drop-offs, and it's just the way it works, I guess.
Good one. Yeah. Cool.
So there you have it, everybody. Bands that waited too damn long. So I want to thank Martin for doing this. This was a fun conversation here. So Martin, what's going on your neck of the woods? Books, Contrarians, podcast. What do you got coming up?
Well, let's see. We had a Contrarians come out on Love It to Death that Marco and I did. So we did that together. We got some Dark Horse panel ones that are going to come up soon. Well, they've been finished, but Turbo, I think there's a Kiss Animalize. Just did my latest episode of History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff podcast. And that was on, what was it on? Let's see. We did Requiems. Oh yeah. It was about songs complaining about the music industry. That was that one. And books, I just got the UK shipment in of UFO. Let's see, how handy is that? Oh, here we go. Actually, these 3 just came in. Oh my God, I'm gonna So so we got the Yes with the new cover and the new title. So it's now called A Visual Biography 1, 1968 to 81, because there's a second part coming that's going to be 1982 to 2022. So that big hardcover. We got the UFO visual biography. That one just came in. The usual, just like all of them. And then we've got the Judas Priest visual biography with a cover photo by a buddy of mine, Rudy Childs, who's got a memoir he's working on right now, which is amazing. What a great story of his, fighting in the pits to get all these photos. There's a bunch of his pictures in here as well, but, basically the usual one of those. So those all just came in from the UK, and that's it. MartinPopoff.com for that stuff.
Cool. Sounds good. So everybody get on over there and get yourself some books. And next week, Martin and I have decided to do a show all about really, really, really obscure albums that we love a lot that you may not know about. So it's always fun talking about obscure stuff, because you're always going to get these other folks out there. It's like, oh yeah, I've had that album for years, but most people are going to like, I never heard of that before. So these are going to be albums that we really love a lot that somehow just missed most people, right? So it could be on major labels or not, but we love them to death, and we just don't understand why these albums just aren't known by more people. So we're going to do what we got to do to make sure that you know about them. Martin, you want to add any context to that at all?
Yeah, so these will be crazy, absolutely underground albums. But we in our discussion, we decided, not to be kind of like the standard record snob about saying, oh, I've got a rare record no one's heard about. No, we're talking about these because we love them so much. So there you go.
Yeah. So, and it could be across any genre. So it's all up for grabs. So stay tuned for that coming up next Friday. We've actually got a couple of weeks worth of really cool programming for you. So stay tuned each and every Friday morning, and visit us on the web at www.seaoftranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. Of course, we're here on YouTube all together, all the damn time. Thanks for watching, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. For Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. Stay tuned for album homework assignment and the UK Connection coming at you Sunday and Monday. Tomorrow is UK Connection. Tomorrow is Saturday. UK Connection. Sunday is album homework assignment. We've got Simon Bray going up against Lewis Nasser. That is going to be a lot of fun for folks, so don't miss it. So stay tuned. So we'll see you all next week at the Funhouse. Everybody take care. Bye-bye.